You are absolutely terrible. I can't believe you said that.
Someone had to tell you the truth eventually.
The night I realized the man I was falling in love with had the power to destroy entire governments. I was sitting across from him at dinner, laughing at something he said, completely unaware that my phone was already tapped. He knew everything about me before I ever told him a single word. He knew my bank account numbers. He knew my mother's maiden name. He knew I cried watching old movies and that I kept a journal I thought no one had ever read. And still I fell for him. Completely. Devastatingly. Stupidly. This is not a story about how love is blind. This is a story about how love can be weaponized. And how I became the collateral damage in a war I didn't even know was being fought. My name is Nora, and 6 months ago my life was painfully ordinary. I was 28, working as a junior data analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment that was slightly too expensive for my salary and slightly too empty for my taste. I had plants I forgot to water, a gym membership I never used, and a running list of movies I kept telling myself I'd watch on weekends that always seemed to fill themselves with nothing instead. I wasn't unhappy. I was just waiting for what I didn't know. My love life was a graveyard of almost relationships. A guy from work who was funny but emotionally unavailable. A Hinge date who spent the entire dinner talking about his ex. A perfectly nice man named Greg who made me feel like warm oatmeal, safe, reliable, and completely joyless. I had almost convinced myself that the kind of love that makes your chest ache, the kind that keeps you awake at 2 a.m. with a smile you can't explain, I had almost convinced myself that didn't exist outside of movies. Then I met Ethan Cole, and everything I thought I knew about love, about safety, about who I was burned to the ground. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is that I would do it again. I met Ethan at a cybersecurity conference I had no business attending. My firm had sent me as a last-minute substitute for my supervisor, who got food poisoning the morning of. I showed up in the wrong shoes, holding a tote bag with the company logo, surrounded by people who spoke a language I barely understood. He noticed me immediately, not in the way men sometimes notice you, that slow, appraising, entitled look. He noticed me the way you'd notice someone standing in the wrong room who clearly knew something no one else did. Curious, intrigued, careful. He walked over and said, "You look like you're translating everything in real time." I laughed, genuinely unexpectedly, and said, "Is it that obvious?" He smiled. Only to me. That was Ethan. Everything was only to him. He was 32, tall, quietly confident, with dark eyes that held your gaze half a second longer than was comfortable, but not in a threatening way. In a way that made you feel like he was actually listening, actually there. In a world full of people who look at their phones while you're mid-sentence, Ethan made you feel like the only signal in the room. He told me he was an independent cybersecurity consultant. Freelance work for major corporations, he said. Testing vulnerabilities, patching weaknesses, keeping data safe. It sounded impressive, legitimate, important. We talked for 3 hours that first night. We missed the keynote speaker. We missed dinner. We stood in a hallway next to a fire exit and talked until the lights in the conference hall started shutting off one by one. He texted me before I even made it to my car. I should have asked myself how he got my number. I didn't give it to him, but I was too busy smiling at my phone to notice. The next 3 weeks were something out of a film. Weekend drives to nowhere in particular. A 4 a.m. conversation about whether it's possible to truly know another person that left me shaking. Dinner at a tiny Italian place where he ordered for both of us in Italian, and was right about what I'd like. He sent me articles about things I'd mentioned once, in passing, never expecting him to remember. He showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday night with a record player and a vinyl he said made him think of me. He was attentive in a way that felt like being studied, and I mistook it for love. What I found next changed everything. But I wasn't ready for it yet. Not by a long way. Started with small things. Tiny fractures in a perfect picture. Ethan had a rule about his laptop. One rule delivered casually, the way you'd mention you don't like cilantro. I keep my work locked down. Don't ever touch it. He said it with a smile. Easy. Light. But the weight of it sat with me. He had 3 phones. He explained away the first 2, one for personal, one for work. The third, a sleek black device he kept in his jacket pocket and never once glanced at in front of me. He never explained at all. There were nights he disappeared. Not in a suspicious, obvious way. He'd be there at dinner, fully present, and then I'd fall asleep and wake at 3 a.m. to find his side of the bed empty and a faint blue light coming from under the bathroom door. When he came back, he smelled like cold air, like he'd been outside. I asked him once what he'd been doing. He said, "Work call. Different time zone. Sorry, I didn't want to wake you." It was reasonable, logical. I accepted it. But then there were the names. I heard them in fragments. A phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear while I was in the kitchen making coffee. Senator Hargrove, Director Chun, a man named Vasquez. Names that didn't mean anything to me then. Names I'd look up later on a night that would change my life entirely. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found in his car. It was an accident. I was looking for a phone charger, opening the glove compartment, and a folded piece of paper slid out. I shouldn't have opened it. I know that, but I did. It was a list of names, 12 of them, and next to each name a number. 6 and 7-figure numbers. And next to the numbers, dates, payments, scheduled, already made. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself I trusted him. I told myself I'd ask him about it when the moment was right. I wish I had. I wish I had asked him that night. Because what I was about to discover in the weeks that followed, I was not equipped to survive it. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not paranoid, observant. There is a difference, and for a while I told myself that's all it was. I Googled his company. The website was clean, professional, minimal. A logo, a contact form, a list of services. But when I tried to look up the company registration, I hit walls. No listed founders. A registered address that turned out to be a shared office space, rented by dozens of different firms. A phone number that went to a voicemail box that had never been set up. I found a photo of him online, just one, from a tech conference 4 years ago. He was listed in the caption as E. Cole, independent researcher. Not a consultant, a researcher. And next to him in the photo was a man in a government lanyard whose face I recognized. It took me 20 minutes of scrolling before I realized who he was. Deputy Director of the NSA's Cyber Division. My hands started shaking, and I still told myself there was an explanation. I started listening more carefully at dinner. Ethan was careful, brilliantly, surgically careful with what he said. But care has edges, and sometimes at the end of a long day, over a second glass of wine, the edges showed. He talked about information the way other people talk about money. Not as a tool, not as knowledge, as power, as currency. He said once, completely casually, "The right secret is worth more than any salary anyone will ever pay you." I laughed. I said, "That sounds like a villain's line." He looked at me, and there was something behind his eyes I'd never seen there before. Not quite amusement, not quite warning, something colder. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just honest." 3 days later, I came home to find my apartment exactly as I left it. Except one thing was different. My journal, the one I kept in the bottom drawer under winter sweaters, was sitting on my nightstand, open, to a page I'd written a year before I ever met him. He had been in my apartment, alone, and he had read it. I told myself I must have left it out. I told myself my memory was off. I told myself anything that kept me from having to accept what I was beginning to feel in the deepest, most honest part of me. That the man I was falling in love with was not who he said he was. Not even close. The night I found out the truth, it wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no confession, no movie moment with music swelling in the background. It was a Wednesday. It was raining, and Ethan made a mistake. He left his secondary laptop, the one he kept locked in a padded case I had never seen him open, on the kitchen counter. He'd left to take a call outside, and somehow the lid was open an inch, and the screen wasn't dark. I know I should have walked away. I know that, but the name on the screen stopped me cold. Senator Raymond Hargrove. The man had been all over the news for the past 2 weeks. A Senate Appropriations Committee hearing, an upcoming election, a reputation as one of the most powerful, most unimpeachable figures in American politics. And on Ethan's screen was a thread of emails that were not from Senator Hargrove's public account. They were from a private address. And they read like a man begging for his life. Please, I've already paid what we agreed. You said that would be the end of it. My family doesn't know. You said my family would never know. Please. There were 17 emails in that thread, each one more desperate than the last. And in between them, Ethan's responses, measured, precise, cold as a machine, listing account numbers, stating amounts, setting deadlines, never threatening overtly, never needing to. Because the threat was the silence. The threat was what he already had. I scrolled up. There were other threats. A governor, a federal judge, a tech billionaire whose name I recognized immediately, a man who ran a cabinet-level agency whose face had been on the cover of 3 magazines in the last year. 12 names total. Just like the list in the glove compartment, Ethan was blackmailing them. All of them. Quietly. Systematically. For years. I wish I never discovered this. I genuinely do. Because knowing it made me a target. And I didn't realize that yet. I heard the front door. I closed the laptop. I walked to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water with hands so steady I couldn't understand why, because inside I was screaming. He walked in, shaking rain off his jacket. He looked at me. He smiled. Everything okay? Perfect, I said. And I smiled back. That was the most dangerous thing I have ever done in my life. I spent the next 4 days acting like nothing had changed. I cooked dinner. I laughed at his jokes. I let him hold me on the couch while we watched television, and I stared at the ceiling counting my own heartbeats, wondering if he could feel them accelerating. I had to think. I had to be careful. Ethan wasn't just a criminal. He was a man who had been hacking into the private communications of some of the most powerful people in the country and using what he found to drain their bank accounts, to own them, to keep them silent. He had done this for years without detection. He was meticulous. He was brilliant. And I was now the only person outside of his operation who knew. I started making quiet moves. I told my sister to expect me for an unplanned visit, code, the kind we'd made up as kids for emergencies she thankfully still remembered. I made photocopies of the list from the glove compartment, which I'd had the foresight to photograph that day before putting it back. I wrote everything I'd seen thread by thread, name by name, in a document I saved on a USB drive I kept in my shoe. And then, on the 5th day, Ethan sat down across from me at breakfast and said something that made my blood go cold. I know you saw the laptop. The air left the room. Completely. Like a vacuum seal had closed around my throat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He just watched me with those careful, impossibly steady eyes and waited. I thought about lying. For exactly 2 seconds I thought about it. And then I realized he already knew I had. He had probably known within hours. He had cameras in his laptop, or he'd checked the screen on log. Or there was something I'd moved, some microscopic tell that a man like Ethan would never miss. Yes, I said. I saw it. He nodded slowly, like I'd answered a question he'd already scored. And now, he said, we need to talk about what happens next. What I found next, what he said next. I genuinely was not prepared for. Nothing could have prepared me for it. He told me everything. Not because I asked. Not because he was afraid. But because he had decided, with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster, that telling me was more useful than keeping me in the dark. Ethan had started the operation 6 years ago. Not for money, though the money was extraordinary. He'd started it because he had something on one man. A senator who had been involved in a data breach that cost 12 federal whistleblowers their lives. He'd found the proof, gone to the authorities and been ignored, shut out, threatened. So he'd handled it himself. I built a cage, he said. A cage where the most dangerous people in this country keep each other silent. They can't expose me without exposing everyone else. And they can't move against each other without me releasing everything. It was a system of mutually assured destruction. Elegant, horrifying, and completely airtight. And then he told me the part that broke me open. He had met me on purpose. My firm had been contracted to do data work for one of his targets, the tech billionaire. Ethan had flagged me as a potential vulnerability, someone the target might have shared files with, someone who might have unknowingly seen something. He'd run a background check. He'd read my digital footprint. He'd planned the conference introduction to the minute. I needed to know what you knew, he said. And then I needed to know if you were trustworthy. And am I? I asked. My voice sounded like someone else's. He looked at me for a long time. That's why I'm still here, he said quietly. And the terrible, humiliating, unforgivable thing, is that part of me, even in that moment, felt something. Because underneath the manipulation and the calculation, I believed him. I still believed him, which is either the most human thing about me or the most broken. I still haven't decided which. I need you to understand something about betrayal. Real betrayal, the kind that rewires you, it doesn't arrive like a bomb going off. It arrives like water. Slow, quiet, working its way into every crack until the foundation you thought you were standing on dissolves underneath you. Ethan had known my middle name, my childhood address, my father's grave location, and the PIN I used for my bank account before we ever met. He had read the journal where I wrote about loneliness and longing and wanting someone who actually saw me, and he had used it. He had built a version of himself designed specifically to be everything that journal asked for. I cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes. I turned the faucet on so he couldn't hear, and then I walked back out, because I had a decision to make. And I had already, God help me, already made it. I gave him the USB drive, not because he asked, not because he threatened me, because I had thought about it for 4 days, and I understood that if I went to the authorities alone, I would spend years being investigated, dismissed, discredited, or disappeared. The men on Ethan's list had too much power and too much to lose. I had nothing but a copy of something I wasn't supposed to have. But with him, with his system, his files, his architecture, there was a different option. I want to be part of this, I said. Or I walk out that door right now and take what I know to the press. He studied me for a very long time. You understand what this means, he said. Once you're in, you can't walk it back. I know, I said. And I did know. And I did it anyway. Because the part of me that loved him, the part that I couldn't amputate no matter how much I wanted to, needed to believe that somewhere under all the calculation, he had also told me the truth in the only way he knew how. By trusting me with all of it. Maybe I was right. Maybe I was catastrophically wrong. I've stopped being sure which is which. That was 4 months ago. Ethan and I still live in the same apartment. We still have dinner together. We still talk about everything, real things, honest things, more honest than anything I've had with another person before. 2 of the 12 men on his list have quietly resigned their positions in the last 60 days. The press cover both as personal decisions, health, family, a desire to spend more time away from public life. I know why they really left. I don't know if what Ethan is doing is justice or extortion. I've turned the question over in my hands like a broken piece of glass. So many times I've stopped being able to find the edges. I don't know if he loves me or if I am the most sophisticated long con of his career. I don't know if I love him or if I'm simply in too deep to see the difference between love and survival. What I do know is this last Tuesday in the middle of the night he woke me up. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark. And he said, very quietly, I didn't plan for this part. What part? I asked. He didn't answer for a long time. And then he said, caring about what happens to you more than what happens to the operation. I don't know if that was the truest thing he's ever said to me, or the most calculated. I'm not sure I want to know, because some truths, once you have them, you can't put them down. And I've been caring enough. The question I can't stop asking myself, the one I'll probably be asking for the rest of my life, is this: when someone uses your deepest truths to create a perfect lie, and then the lie becomes something real, is what grows between you love? Or just the most elegant trap you've ever walked into? I still don't know the answer. And some nights I think that's the most dangerous part of all. Like, share and don't forget to subscribe for more. Have a good evening.